The cab screeched to a halt outside the house, its tires splashing water from the persistent downpour. My heart pounded against my ribs as I handed the driver a crumpled bill, barely noticing his muttered thanks before he drove off, leaving me alone in the storm. The cold rain sliced through my thin jacket, but the chill came more from the dread curling in my stomach. I was late, so late that time had lost its meaning. Every minute I'd been out had added another weight to the growing knot of fear pressing down on me. I couldn't blame traffic or a lost phone. There were no excuses that could erase this. The house loomed ahead, its porch light glowing dimly, through the rain like an unblinking eye. Each step toward it felt heavier, the squelch of my soaked shoes like a countdown to something inevitable. I reached the porch, hesitating at the door. My hand hovered over the knob, slick with rain and trembling. Maybe, just maybe, he'd gone to bed. I imagined the comforting silence of an empty living room, the soft creak of the stairs as I slipped into my room unnoticed. It was a fragile hope, but I clung to it. The knob turned easily, but as I pushed the door open, the hinges betrayed me with a groan that echoed through the quiet house. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, straining to hear anything beyond the steady tick of the clock in the hallway. The air inside was thick, oppressive, as though the house itself was waiting for something. I stepped inside, careful to close the door silently behind me, my wet clothes dripping onto the hardwood floor. The glow from the living room spilled into the hallway, and my stomach twisted into knots. He was still awake. I took a doubtful step forward, my heartbeat roaring in my ears. The rain outside faded into the background, leaving only the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of my own breathing. Then I saw him. He sat in his favorite chair, the flickering light of the fireplace painting shadows across his face. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared at me, his gaze sharp. It was the kind of look that pinned me in place, like a predator sizing up its prey.
"You're late,"
he said, his voice calm but cutting. The weight of those two words made my knees feel weak. My throat tightened, and I couldn't bring myself to respond. The calm in his voice was more terrifying than anger. "I know," I whispered, my voice barely audible. My hands fidgeted at my sides, the wet fabric of my clothes clinging to me like a second skin. I lost track of time." The words felt hollow and lifeless, and I hated how feeble they sounded. His eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward slightly, the firelight catching the edge of his jawline. For a moment, he didn't say anything, but the silence was deafening. Then he stood, the movement calculated and slow, as though he was giving me time to realize just how much trouble I was in. I instinctively took a step back, but the cold wood of the door pressed against my spine. There was nowhere to go.
"Lost track of time?"
He repeated, his voice sharp with disbelief. He was taller than me, his presence filling the room as he closed the distance between us. He was my father, someone I feared. I knew Mom was asleep and could not come to save me. Finally, he said,
"That's the best you've got?"
My mouth opened to respond, but nothing came out. The authority in his tone and the way he carried himself made me feel small, insignificant. I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. I didn't think it would matter, I stammered, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. He let out a short, humorless laugh, and the sound sent a chill down my spine.
You made it.
"You didn't think it would matter?"
He repeated, shaking his head slowly.
"That's the problem, isn't it? You never think."
His words hung in the air like a challenge, daring me to argue, but I couldn't. My throat felt like it was closing, and I clenched my fists at my sides, trying to ground myself. The fire crackled softly in the background, the only sound in the heavy silence. His presence was overwhelming, and I felt trapped, caught in the web of his disappointment and barely restrained anger. "I'm sorry," I finally managed, my voice cracking under the weight of the moment. But the apology felt meaningless, a flimsy attempt to patch the growing split between us. He took another step closer, and the air between us grew impossibly tight. charged with tension.
Sorry?
He said, his voice quieter now but no less sharp.
You think sorry fixes this?
His eyes bore into mine, searching for something, an answer, an explanation, a spark of remorse that wasn't there. I wanted to look away, to escape the intensity of his gaze, but I couldn't. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in as his frustration crackled like static in the air. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and the silence was deafening. Then he leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a low, almost dangerous tone.
You don't get it, do you?
He asked. His words weighed well, each one a heavy stone dropping into the churning waters of my guilt.
It's not just about being late. It's about trust, about respect.
The fire in the hearth crackled louder, the sound almost mocking. My chest tightened as his words sank in, each one cutting deeper than the last. My mind scrambled for something to say, something that would break the suffocating This is tension. going viral. But the truth was, I didn't know how to fix this. I didn't know how to make it right. The weight of his disappointment pressed down on me like a physical force, and I felt tears sting at the corners of my eyes. I blinked them away quickly, not wanting to show weakness. But the truth was, I was crumbling inside, and he could see it.
You didn't think.
He said again, softer this time, almost as if he was speaking to himself.
And that's the problem. You never think about how your actions affect anyone else.
I opened my mouth to respond, but the lump in my throat made it impossible. The storm outside raged on, but it was nothing compared to the storm building inside this room, and I had no idea how to weather it. Then he spoke, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade, sharp and relentless.
Do you have any idea what you've put me through tonight?
He stepped closer, his towering frame drawing a suffocating line between the space that kept us apart. His tone rose, shaking with a mixture of anger and something deeper, something that felt more personal. I took a shaky step back, my pulse quickening as I hit the edge of the kitchen counter. I didn't mean to worry you, I said softly, my voice trembling. The heat in his eyes pinned me where I stood.
Sorry doesn't change the fact that I sat here wondering if something happened to you. If someone had...
His voice cracked and he ran a hand through his disheveled hair.
Do you think I care so little?
The rawness in his voice disarmed me. My throat tightened and my gaze fell to the floor, guilt clawing at my insides. He then stepped forward, my back pressed against the counter now, and the closeness of him sent shivers through me. His hand reached out, tilting my chin up, forcing me to look at him.
You're so young.
He whispered, his thumb brushing lightly against my jawline.
So reckless.
His touch was firm but gentle, and I hated how much I leaned into it, how much I wanted more. I just could not understand why I was having these thoughts. He was my father, my own father. However, the way he was looking at me made me forget what relation I had with him. Then he spoke, saying,
This isn't just about tonight.
His voice dropping to a whisper that felt like it was meant for my ears alone. His thumb lingered on my cheek, tracing slow, deliberate circles that left my skin burning under his touch.
There's something else between us, isn't there?
The question hung in the air, heavy and charged. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I don't know what you're talking about. I lied, my voice shaking as I tried to step away. But he didn't let me, his hand catching my wrist and pulling me back to him.
Yes, you do,
he said firmly, his eyes boring into mine. Was he drunk? Was he not really himself? Why was he doing this? The heat radiating off his body was intoxicating, and his grip on my wrist sent jolts of electricity through me.
You felt it too. Don't deny it.
I tried to look away, but his fingers found their way under my chin again, lifting my face until there was no escape. His other hand moved to my back, pressing me closer, and the contact sent a firestorm through my veins.
Say something.
He urged, his voice softer now but no less commanding.
Tell me I'm imagining this.
I couldn't speak. My lips separated, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, a shiver ran through me as his fingers traced the line of my jaw, down my neck, lingering at the hollow of my throat. His touch was light, each brush of his fingertips stoking the flames of something I knew I shouldn't feel. "I shouldn't be here," I whispered again, the words barely escaping my trembling lips. My chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, every inch of my body betraying the war raging in my mind. His hand still rested on my hip, his thumb drawing slow, deliberate circles against my bare skin, just under the hem of my shirt. It was a touch so subtle, yet it burned like fire. He is my father. I was trying to think this. He could not do anything that I feared. Perhaps he was testing me, seeing when I submit so he could know whether I could be trusted or not about my character. Perhaps he wanted to see what I would do if any other man did this to me. He leaned in, his breath warm against my neck, his voice low and intoxicating.
And yet, here you are.
He murmured, his lips brushing just lightly against my ear, sending an unexpected shiver down my spine.
What are you so afraid of?
I couldn't answer. Every word felt caught in my throat, every thought drowned out by the way his touch made my skin tingle. My hands found his chest, intending to push him away, but instead, my fingers betrayed me, curling into the soft fabric of his shirt. The solid warmth of his body beneath my touch was maddening. I had never been close to a man. Never like this.
Tell me to stop,
He whispered, his lips ghosting along my jawline, trailing down toward the sensitive curve of my neck. His teeth grazed my skin, just enough to make me gasp, the sound so unfamiliar to my own ears that it shocked me.
Tell me you don't want this, and I will.
But I didn't. I couldn't. My breath hitched as his hand slid beneath my shirt, his palm warm and firm as it trailed up my back, stopping just below my shoulder blades. The heat of his touch was unlike anything I'd ever felt before, igniting a part of me I didn't even know existed. His lips pressed against the hollow of my throat, lingering there as if he knew how it unraveled me. My voice faltered, the words spilling out in broken fragments. His head lifted, his dark eyes locking with mine.
Never?
He repeated, his voice thick with curiosity, his lips curving into a slow, almost dangerous smile.
Then let me show you.
I didn't have time to protest or agree before his mouth was on mine with a hunger that left me breathless. His kiss was deep, consuming, as though he wanted to claim every part of me. My fingers clutched at his shirt, pulling him closer, even as my mind screamed at me to pull away. When his hand slid lower, past the curve of my waist, his fingers teasing the waistband of my jeans, my entire body hardened. I froze, unsure of what would happen next, unsure of what I wanted to happen. He paused, sensing my hesitation, his lips breaking away from mine just enough to whisper,
Relax. Just let go.
And then, his fingers dipped lower, tracing slow, deliberate paths that sent shockwaves through me. I could feel his hands at the point I never allowed any man to reach. My back arched, a gasp escaping my lips as pleasure coursed through me. It was so unexpected, so intense, that I couldn't stop the soft moan that followed.
You've never felt this before, have you?
He asked, his voice a dark whisper against my ear. I shook my head, unable to form coherent words. The way his hands moved, the way his lips explored every inch of exposed skin, made me feel things I didn't know I was capable of feeling. Every touch was deliberate, calculated, and designed to draw reactions from me that I didn't know I could give. When he lifted me, carrying me effortlessly to my bedroom, I should have protested. He knew he could not take me to his bedroom because Mom was there. She did not know he was not sleeping beside her. I should have told him to stop, but instead I found myself leaning into him, craving the heat of his body, the way his hands made me feel weightless and grounded all at once. He laid me down gently, his hands bracketing my head as he hovered above me, his gaze heavy with a desire that both thrilled and terrified me. His lips began their descent again, trailing down my neck, over my collarbone, his teeth gently biting my skin in ways that made my body tremble. When his hand slid further, exploring in ways no one ever had, I let out a sharp gasp, my eyes flying open in shock. The sensation was overwhelming, a mix of pleasure and disbelief that left me breathless.
It's okay.
He murmured, his voice soft yet commanding.
Just let yourself feel.
I thought he would stop. I thought that was enough. The test should have ended here. But he kept going. Every touch, every kiss, every movement opened me, stripping away every layer of restraint I'd spent a lifetime building. The way he explored me as though he were uncovering secrets I didn't know I had was both terrifying and exciting. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his thumb brushing against my cheek.
I want you to feel everything,
he said, his voice a low promise. And I did. For the first time, I felt alive, completely and utterly consumed by sensations I never thought possible. I shouldn't be here, I whispered again, but this time the words were hollow, meaningless, because at that moment, there was nowhere else I wanted to be. He'd excited me enough, and now was the time to do the forbidden. But before he did that, he made me sit on the floor on my knees. I knew what was coming, but I did not believe it until I could feel him in my hand. He let me watch it, and then, holding my head gently, he made me kiss it. I hesitated. I had never done it before. I didn't know what to do and how to do it. Then, he lifted me, gently placing me on the bed. I was lying on my back when he lifted my legs. I was scared. I was unprepared when I felt it in me. With a push, it was in me. I could not hold my scream, and he immediately put his hand on my mouth, covering it so he could push more. I had never felt before the pleasure I was feeling at that moment. He continued for 20 minutes until we both were breathless. His forehead rested against mine, our breaths mingling in the charged silence that felt both intimate and suffocating. His eyes, dark and unreadable, bore into mine, and I could see the storm of emotions reflected there. Regret, desire, fear, and something else I couldn't quite name.
This changes everything,
He said, his voice low but steady, laced with a mix of regret and resolve. Each word landed heavily, as a stone dropped into the still waters of our fragile reality, sending ripples of consequence in every direction. I know, I whispered, though my voice wavered under the weight of my own admission. The words were barely audible, as if saying them too loudly would make them even more real. My mind was spinning, torn between the sharp edges of guilt and a strange, undeniable sense of relief. It was as though the very thing I had been running from had finally caught me, and in its wake, I felt both liberated and chained. I knew this guilt would stay with me forever, a shadow engraved into my soul that no light could fully erase. Every choice, every moment that led to this, replayed in my mind like a haunting memory. Nothing could undo it. Nothing could change what had been done. And with that, we stepped into the unknown, the weight of our choices heavy on our shoulders but no longer unbearable.